Emily, welcome to the podcast. It's been
Thank
a while
you.
for us to actually connect and make this happen. I think a few months actually.
Yes.
And unfortunately, my email was going to your junk mail, which I'm very offended.
Darn algorithms and
Yes, yeah, they said there's that Richard Bernard. We don't want her to get access to him. So, anyway, I'm just grateful that we've had time together and we're here to discuss your book, which I believe is coming out in March.
the children's book
Yes,
is
the
just
Lost for
came out.
Littles.
It just released on February 13th.
Oh, February 13th. Okay.
So
I didn't
just this
have
week.
that. That's one part of the notes I didn't have in front of me, but I knew it was just in the process of coming out
That's
or
right.
actually has come out. And it's titled The Lost for Littles, a guide for Latter day Saint families dealing with death. How did this book come about?
Well, when I was pregnant with our third pregnancy, we had a daughter who was 5 and a daughter who was 2. And we found out we were pregnant with identical twin boys. And this was
Hmm.
back in 2016. And I was equal parts terrified and excited. And in the end, the pregnancy ended up resulting in one stillborn twin and one living twin. And as we processed our grief, I'm a reader and my dad is a psychologist. And so my go-to was like, okay, well, what resources are there out there to help my family through this challenging time? And I remember going into the bookstore and there was a bereavement section or a remembrance section, some stores call it, of Deseret Book. And I walked directly there and what was surprising to me is, I passed bookshelves of scripture study resources and shelves of proper romance and, all sorts of different topics. And the bereavement section was one shelf, one tiny little
Hmm.
shelf. Um, and there was maybe at the time, I mean, this was several years ago, but at the time there were only two children's books on there, and neither of them, most of them were more like artwork and like um not it just didn't speak to me, the resources that were available. I was hoping for something that would walk me through what to say to my children in preparation for a funeral, and how to navigate grief with a young child, and that resource just didn't exist. And so that was something that I keenly felt at the time, and I thought, wow, it would be really great if someone could produce something that would help them do a step-by-step guide through this process. And it wasn't until the next year that I started writing my first book, Is There No Other Way? And through the next few years, I was able to get that book published. And so then at that point, I had the resources, the contacts, and the confidence to realize, okay, this book still doesn't exist. And here we are 5 years later. And I guess I'm going to have to be the one to write it if I want it to exist. And I was able to partner with Esther Ballum Biggs. And she and I were in the same home ward growing up, and her father, some people might remember Michael Ballum. Um, and he's an incredibly talented singer and performer. And Esther was a trauma nurse. I'm sorry, not a trauma nurse. She worked in mental health and helped with people who'd had traumatic experiences with their mental health. And then she had transitioned into working in the women's health industry. And she had so much firsthand experience with helping mothers who had just at that moment had a loss, and she would be their first person to turn to, in their appointments, as they had discovered that the baby's heartbeat had stopped, or other such problems. And so she was just the perfect partner because she understood from the medical side and from having dealt with so many patients who had had this experience. And we were able to marry my words with her artwork and create what I feel is exactly the book that I wish I had had when we lost our son.
Well, it's a great book. I have read it. For an adult, it's a very easy read.
Mhm. Yep.
And it's written by, I believe, well, the it's written as a young girl, and I think it's your daughter that you're using as a model, a
Yes, that's
10-year-old
right.
girl, if I'm correct.
Hmm.
And she's telling the story.
Hmm.
And so it's written at that level, which I think is great. The artwork is really interesting. I was really drawn to it. And I was also wondering, okay, now uh, Esther Biggs lives in northern Utah, and you live in
Hmm.
southern Utah. And I go, how did you two meet? And
Yeah.
so that you explain that.
Hmm.
One went for
We
the
grew
snow,
up
stayed
together.
with the snow, and the other decided to go where it's a little bit warmer.
Yeah, that's right.
So now you said you have that first book. Is there no other way? What is that about? And it does say
Um,
exploring. I'm sorry, exploring growth through grief.
mhm. That was my debut book, and it was quite the journey to write that book. For me, it was a way to process the emotions of our loss and try to understand grief on a grander scale. I think sometimes we talk about universal suffering, and it's so big and so broad, and so it's hard to wrap our head around it. So as I was about a year after our son had passed, um, I was trying to grapple with this whole concept that everybody hurts. And so knowing that I should then not hurt as much, right? If I can recognize that I'm sitting in my house with my own heartbreak and my next door neighbor is suffering from an illness, and the house next to her has a son with a drug addiction, and on and on. Every household has their suffering. And that became really interesting to me. I wanted to go from this really broad bird's eye view and zoom in the lens to one small speck on planet Earth. And so I decided that I would interview 50 women within a 5 mile radius of one another about their experiences with sorrow. And it ended up just being an absolute education for me in the human heart and in how we face our trials, and the beautiful things that can come because of the hard things we suffer in this life. Um, so what started out for me as more of just like an experiment for myself to really help myself process and to come to know the women around me better, transformed into this really beautiful book called Is There No Other Way? Exploring Growth Through Grief. And the book takes vignettes from each of those interviews, which ended up, to me, one of the most surprising parts about the whole process is I thought that um, I would be lucky if a few women agreed to visit about the hardest things they've ever gone through. And I was shocked that out of all the women I reached out to, I only had two decline. And everyone else was not only willing, but anxious to share.
Mm.
Um, and when we would sit down for these interviews, I would plan maybe an hour to two. And these women would be in my home for 4 and 5 hours, sharing their hearts and the struggles of their life. And it was just a really sacred experience. I feel very privileged that I had the opportunity to be the pen to capture that, and to be so what's the word I'm looking for? It was just such an honor to have them share their hearts with me.
Well, with women, they tend to be one to share their feelings more. If you'd ran the same thing on men,
Do you know though, what's interesting is one of my interviewees, as I visited with her, one of the big struggles of her life was her husband's chronic pain. And he ended up coming in as we interviewed, because some of them they came to my home and some I went to theirs. And he came in and sat down and visited with us. And then um, she said, "Well, really, you should just do an interview with him." And I said, well, "I'd be honored to if you're okay with that." So I actually came back and did an interview just with him. And he said to me, he's like, "I wish that men would do this more often."
mm,
And he said, "We need each other just as much as the women do. We just pretend we don't."
yes, having sat in priesthood meetings. Let's see. I joined the church about 20, over 50 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's hard to get men to talk.
Yes, it
and,
is.
and especially if they have problems or
Hmm.
if they're unhappy at work or something, everything is always just okay. And then I've had chances to be in Relief Society as an interpreter, and the women just talk and open up, and I go, whoa, there is really a difference between men and
Yeah, you're
women.
right. There is. There is, but we definitely all need each other, don't we?
Yes, 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 we sure do. Well, the artwork interested me because, and I've seen this type of artwork where uh, on the face, and even there's no fingers on the hands. It looks like they're
Mm.
wearing mittens, and there are no eyes, nose, and mouth, and ears. Um, I'm curious how that came about. Is that how she normally? Because I know there's some artists that do that, and I don't know
Hmm.
anything about art, what that's called. But is that something you guys discussed, or how did that come about?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was an intentional choice, and it was the reason I reached out to Esther in the first place. I have, as I've done my research on grief and really have been in the lost community now for about 8 years, um, I have noticed that there's this interesting phenomenon with children where, and this is just in life in general, that children tend to mirror the emotion of the person in power in their
Hmm.
life or the person in authority. So oftentimes, when a child is going through trauma, they will look to the person that they consider the source of stability or power or leadership in their life, and they will see how that person is reacting. So, and then they will mirror those emotions. So, for myself with my children, I'm very emotive and my husband is not. And so this was challenging for them because they looked to mama when their brother died. And I was, of course, very emotional and in tears often. And my husband, he cried only the day of our son's burial. And beyond that, he's just not an emotive person. He feels deeply, and he is a great he connects well with others. It's just not his way. And so for them, that was really confusing to try and navigate. Do we mirror dad? Do we mirror mom?
Hmm.
Do we like how do we honor our own feelings through this experience? And so with the artwork, I wanted to make sure that the children reading this book with their loved ones would feel safe to have their own emotional experience and be able to honor that without feeling like, oh, this character on this page is crying. So I should, if I'm not crying at this funeral, there must be something wrong with me. Um, no, I didn't want them to have that. I didn't want them to have that extra level of confusion. So that was an intentional choice to have the faceless portraits because I wanted them to be able to take the information and apply it to their own hearts and their own lives without the extra layer of trying to navigate what the other characters or the other people around them were feeling as well.
Clearly, this book has been done with a lot of thought. And what came to my mind is that you even mentioned cremation. And I was
Hmm.
thinking, I don't know, I don't think you're not writing this book just for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but because of the publisher and everybody, mainly it will be that type of audience. And cremation is just something we don't talk about. And I thought it was
Hmm.
very interesting that you mentioned it, and I thought that was
Well, I
great.
think that's in part because so my family's pretty international, and I had a sister who lived in Singapore for 11 years, and there's no space there for traditional burials, and
Right.
so everyone in Singapore is cremated. And my father actually wants to be cremated because he has beef with the expense of the funeral industry. And so there's in the handbook it says that cremation is acceptable and it is, but you're right, it's not traditionally done.
Right.
Um, and our goal is that we have a general Christian Lost for Littles book. And then this is our second one, the Lost for Littles for Latter-day Saint families. And then we are currently doing interviews with members of other faiths,
Oh,
from Judaism to Buddhism, Hinduism, and Chinese traditionalism. And so our goal is to have an entire series of books that will address the funeral experience from each religion, each major world religion, so that a child can feel comfortable with any of these books, because obviously a child in West Africa is going to have a very different burial experience than a
yes,
child in
yes,
Utah, you know.
yes,
and,
absolutely. Yeah.
and so I think it's important that they get to have grief addressed from whatever cultural experience they're coming from.
Yeah, I'm very aware of that in other countries, like you said, in Singapore, you don't have a choice. It is cremation,
Hmm.
but it's not just often discussed within
Yeah,
the LDS
you're right.
community. Yes. Now, you are also the creator of Moms of Missing Multiples.
Mhm.
Um, is that on the internet? How does that work?
Yeah, so when I first became pregnant with my twins, I was on a Facebook group called Mormon Moms of Multiples. And then President Nelson came out with his talk, really helping us to remember to emphasize the full name of the church, and to step away from using the term Mormon when we identify ourselves. So these cute ladies on the Mormon Moms of Multiples page, they changed the name of their group to Ministering Moms of Multiples. And it was shortly thereafter that one of our twins passed. And so I felt um, just, I didn't know where I belonged anymore, because on the surface, I was no longer a mom of multiples, because I wouldn't be raising twins in this life. But my heart still felt like a multiple mom. And all my dreams for my kids had been based on that identifier as twins, you know. So I formed an offshoot group on Facebook called Ministering Moms of Missing Multiples. And then anytime there was a loss in the Mormon Moms page, then they would redirect them to come and join our page if they wanted a safe space to talk to other mothers who knew intimately the pain of losing one or two or three multiples, depending on um, their unique pregnancy situations. So there are about 150 of us in that group, and it's always a kind of somber day when I get a new request for a new member to come in, because that comes bearing lots of weight, um, and sometimes it's really quiet on there for months at a time, and then a mama will jump on there and say, "Oh, I had a really hard day today," or "We did this really neat thing to honor our angel baby," or it's just a really safe space where women can come and talk about their angel babies without being worried about being misunderstood, because everybody in there understands.
Be sure to give me a link to that, and I will put that in the show notes for
Yeah,
those
I'd love
that
to.
would like to visit that site. Your book ends with a wonderful glossary, and it is simple. I understood it.
Oh, good. That's high praise.
There were no big words in there. I did just fine. But yeah, the glossary I thought was very, very helpful.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, for me, the whole goal of this book is that people will sit down with their children. It's too much text for a little person to sit through the whole book all at once. It's 80 pages of text with illustrations, so about 40 pages of text. And um, my goal is not that they sit down and read it all in one fell swoop. It's that they sit down and they read a section and they discuss their unique loss with their child, or grandchild, or niece, nephew, whatever the situation may be. And what surprised me is, as I went through and had each of these words that might be unfamiliar to children, and I ran them past my own children, who, because their mom writes about grief and loss, and we talk about it regularly, and I run these loss support groups and whatnot, I just thought they knew more. And it was such a testament to me that, like, sometimes we think we've explained things to our children, or maybe we have once, but maybe once isn't enough. And so there's also talking points at the end of the book besides the glossary to really help guide these discussions and make sure that And the book is being utilized as a tool to connect more so than a tool to even inform or certainly I wouldn't say to entertain. It's definitely to inform and to provide connection.
How do you, well, how can I put this? What advice would you give, say to me, that somebody in our ward, and our ward is made up of a lot of young marrieds. When I say young marrieds, they've been married maybe up to 10 years, and some are just a
Sure.
year or two, but that actually lose a child. What would you suggest I do or say?
Well, I believe each loss is so individual and each family, excuse me, each family processes loss so differently, and that the spirit really has to be your guide on knowing what this particular family will need. For example, my sister just had the loss of her 6-year-old daughter in December
Mm.
to a brain tumor. And it was devastating for her and for the whole family. Um, and the things that were helpful to me after our son died have not necessarily been helpful to her. And it's really reminded me of how unique we all are, and the need for the Holy Ghost to guide us to touch their hearts in the way that they need. But there are maybe a few things I would counsel against. There are a few expressions that we often say after someone has passed um, that can be pretty hurtful. Things like the expression "at least," followed by anything. So, in our circumstance, we had one living twin and one that had passed, and this expression we heard was, "At least you were able to take one baby home from the hospital,"
Mm.
or "At least one survived," or and those expressions are not helpful. They're very painful. I would say also any kind of platitude like, you know, they're with Jesus now, or um, I'm trying to think of some. The point of this is that people, they mean so well, but we often stumble in our attempts to heal or help. And I would just say the best thing you can just say to any kind of grieving family is, "We're so sorry.
Mm.
We love you." And leave it at that.
Mm.
Unless if you feel so called upon the Spirit to say or do anything more, expressions of sorrow and love are really all that person needs to hear. And they don't. I would also steer clear of when they're fresh from their grief, comparing it to any other grief that you've had in your own life, because often people are trying to connect, and so they'll share with the griever their own grief to
Mm.
show that they understand. But when you are grieving, hearing someone else's story of sorrow just adds another layer of pain on top of your already wounded heart. And there will be times for those conversations, months or years down the road. But when someone is fresh off of their pain, I feel the best thing we can do is just love and then kind of step out of the way and
Mm.
let them work through their pain.
That reminded me, I lost my first wife from cancer, and
Mm,
we had somebody in our ward who lost their husband because of COVID.
mm,
Um, but I waited a while, but I just asked how she was doing,
mm-hmm.
and um, and then I said, I know what you're going through because I lost my first wife, and she said, I didn't know that, and all of a sudden her whole persona changed because she found somebody that could identify with what she's going through.
Certainly. Well, and I love that you gave space and then approached her when you felt the nudge to do so.
Yeah,
That's
and I stay in touch with widows of friends of mine. A good friend of mine died, and I just contact her once a year and just say, "How are you doing?" So,
I love that.
yeah,
Yeah, and that is. that's a really great piece of advice right there is I had a sister-in-law who um she would just call me about once every 6 months and she'd say, I just wondered if you wanted to talk about Aiden today. And um still very tender to my heart is that to know that she was thinking of him and thinking of me and giving me an opportunity to speak about him if I needed to. That was very, very precious to me.
Your book serves a great purpose. It's a great book. It's got great artwork in it.
Thank you.
And where can people find it?
They can find it on the Cedar Fort website, cedarfort.com. They can find it in the Amazon uh, catalog, and also the Is There No Other Way is available in Deseret bookstores, Siegel Books, Target, and trying to remember the LDS bookstores.
Well, thank you for your time and thank you for writing the book. I can see where there's a great need for it.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it.
So you have a great day.
You too.